When Bishop Mike first invited me to preach here at Grace on an upcoming Sunday, I tried to be unavailable today. And it wasn't because I'd planned on being anywhere else. In fact, I didn't check my personal calendar until long after I had studied the lectionary calendar and determined that today's gospel reading was not going to lend itself to easy sermon preparation. Matthew presents us today with a parable, one of many stories that Jesus told to instruct his disciples. By now we know how these sorts of tales work. Somewhere in here is an example of what we shouldn't do or should do, or what the Pharisees are doing, or how God's followers are supposed to behave. And indeed, commentaries on this particular parable have gone so far in defining the characters in the story for us as to label the inanimate objects as well as people. I'm told that the fence is actually the law and the watchtower is the temple. But I worry sometimes that these acts of labeling and that our human tendency to want to insert ourselves into the midst of the story distracts us from asking the more important question: where is God in this reading? A landowner plants a vineyard, Jesus tells us. He digs a fence and builds a fence and generally does everything that's necessary so that the vineyard can yield a decent harvest. And then he leases it to some tenants and he goes abroad. When harvest time comes, the landowner sends his slaves to collect the share of the harvest that is due to him as the owner. But the tenants have no interest in paying up, so they slaughter the slaves and keep the harvest for themselves. The landowner tries again, sending even more slaves to collect the harvest, but they too are met with violence at the hands of the tenants. So the landowner sends his son to collect, thinking that surely the tenants will respect the son. The tenants are unimpressed. They decide to kill the son as well as inherit the vineyard and keep all the fruits that it produces for all the years to come. Now, to be honest, this scheme of the tenants sounds a bit outlandish to me. Do they really think this is going to work? That if they just kill everyone, they can get out of paying the landowner the fruits that he is due? Do they think that the landowner is going to run out of slaves to send, or that there are no more heirs to be had, or that the landowner is just going to suddenly give up? Or maybe the tenants don't care about the repercussions. Maybe the tenants are angry that the landowner hasn't been there toiling alongside them producing these fruits. Maybe they don't think the landowner has earned his share, in spite of everything that the landowner did to set up the vineyard in the first place. Either way, the logic seems a bit off to me. But then the landowner's logic in this story isn't very much more impressive. When the landowner first sends his slaves to collect his portion of the harvest, they're beaten, stoned, and killed. So what does the landowner do? He sends some more, and the same thing happens again. It was Albert Einstein who defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Then the landowner has the bright idea to send his own son, alone, to meet these bloodthirsty tenants. Kind of seems like the landowner doesn't really care how much any of this costs him, how many attempts it takes to retrieve the harvest, how many lives are lost along the way, which leaves me circling back to that first question: where is God in all of this? Then again, maybe we have it all wrong. Maybe the landowner didn't set out to a foreign land because he didn't care about the vineyard, but because he wanted to allow the tenants to flourish. Maybe the landowner is not reckless in his methods of collecting the harvest, but determined to achieve the right end. Maybe he isn't returning to the tenants again and again out of stubbornness or greed, but rather because he loves them too much to accept their rejection. Maybe the landowner is so crazily desperate for a real, give-and-take, meaningful relationship with the tenants that he would do anything, risk anything to make it happen. much like God has done for us. What will the landowner do when he comes? Jesus asks at the conclusion of the story. And all his audience can imagine is more violence. He'll put them to a miserable death, they insist. But notice here that this is not Jesus speaking. This is not part of the parable. This is the part of the story where the listeners begin to condemn themselves for being selfish, for rejecting what matters, for keeping all God's blessings for themselves. And so I have to believe that Jesus' question here is a question for us as well, that we are also invited to ponder what the landowner will do when he comes. And that is a question that we already know the answer to. God sent his Son to those of us who find it all too easy to reject God when the timing's inconvenient, or the request is greater than we would like, or we don't feel like listening to God's call. God comes to us again and again, and again and again we tell God no. But God doesn't give up on us, in spite of our selfish ways. And when we killed God's Son, God raised him from the dead and sent him back to us again, still bearing the message of a God so crazy with love for us that nothing will keep him away. Some have read this parable as an admonition, a warning that God will take it all away if we reject him too many times. And it is true that the fruits of God's blessings flourish among those who listen to and heed God's call. But this is not a story of vengeance. This is a story of love, a story of promise, of hope. This is a story of a God who is not going anywhere, no matter how badly we act or how hard we push. God has come to us in love. How will we receive him?